We might think that the greatest danger facing teachers comes from unruly pupils. But in more and more countries, they're being harassed, threatened, and even butchered in front of their students. In this film, we'll be asking why teachers are increasingly being seen as legitimate targets by repressive governments or armed factions.
Teachers have voices. Teachers quite often are agents for change. Teachers are community leaders. Teachers can mobilize a community. Teachers can speak up. Teacher unions speak up for quality education. They speak up for education for all. And in some cases, this is not what the regime of the day wants.
I'm Brendan O'Malley, and as international editor of the TES and in other roles in journalism, I've been writing about education for more than 20 years. And the most chilling, shocking trend I've discovered is that increasingly around the world, teachers are being singled out for murder, torture, imprisonment by rebels and regimes.
The most dangerous country to be a teacher is Colombia, where dozens are murdered each year. They're targeted by right and left-wing militia because they speak up on behalf of their communities.
Almost every week there'll be an assassination of a teacher. On average, in recent years, there have been well over 40 teachers killed each year. Teachers are forced into exile every year due to threats. There are attacks, physical attacks on teachers. Teachers every year are disappeared, forcibly disappeared. The majority of murders of teachers occur in rural areas, and in small towns in the Colombian countryside, teachers are, in many cases, the majority I'd say, they're the only people with a university education, they're the only people who've lived in a city for some period of their lives, so they're looked to as natural community leaders by the population.
One of the worst cases of persecution involves Raquel Castro and Samuel Morales, two ordinary teachers who became active in their trade union.
I actually met Samuel 5 years ago in a cafe in London. He had just fled Colombia, where assassins had tried to kill him at a funeral. And I remember he was a passionate man, passionate about teaching, passionate about his pupils. He was the only teacher in a school of 45 pupils, aged 5 to 12. And what turned him to campaigning was the fact that there was a foreign oil company taking 400 barrels of oil a day right next door, while there he was teaching under a leaky palm leaf roof with no water to drink, no toilets and no textbooks.
But Samuel's trade union work made him a target. He and his wife and 4 children had to keep moving from house to house. He never went anywhere without a pistol, and like other union leaders, he needed a bulletproof vest, a bulletproof car, and 2 bodyguards to protect him.
We talked together for a couple of hours. He told me about his love of teaching. And I think the saddest thing was that he told me that in the end he had to give it up. He was worried that they would come for him in the classroom, they might try to kill him, and if they missed, they might kill some of his children instead.
But a year after I met him in London, Samuel and his colleague Raquel faced an ordeal more terrifying than anyone could have imagined.
Raquel and Samuel were both officials of the regional CUT. CUT is the Colombian TUC, Trade Union Congress. They had gone to a small village to join in a campaign, or rather to lead a campaign, to protect the simple peasant farmers, the campesinos, from being driven off their land in order to facilitate oil exploration. They were all under death threat because of their previous trade union activity. There were 5 of these CUT colleagues on the delegation. Because they'd had previous death threats, they slept in separate houses. A murder squad from the uniformed official government army came in the night, found 3 of them where they were sleeping, took them out into the street and shot them. They didn't find Samuel and Raquel during their first sweep of the buildings. They found them a little later. Raquel and Samuel both were then subjected to the most appalling psychological pressure. They were both put before firing squads more than once, led to believe they were going to be shot, but the executions weren't actually carried through.
Raquel and Samuel spent 3 years in prison. Although they've now been released, there are still fears for their lives. There's also growing international concern that armed forces are killing teachers in Colombia and no one is being prosecuted.
There was a study done last year of just under 2,500 trade unionists who'd been murdered in Colombia in the last 10 to 15 years. Not all of them teachers, but about half of them were teachers. And they found that of all those 2,500 cases, there'd been only 2 convictions. Neither of those cases were of murdered teachers. So fundamentally, you can kill a teacher in Colombia and you can get away with it because the state doesn't pursue people, doesn't make an effort to punish people who are responsible.
We went to Addis Ababa, the Ethiopian capital, where a repressive government has for many years clamped down on freedom of speech and harassed teachers.
The full spectrum of persecution takes place from assassinations all the way through to those who might simply speak out or can make a complaint. They're often dismissed or indeed moved to from a city maybe or a large town to some very remote area.
They're regarded as opponents of the government in a situation where peaceful criticism, peaceful opposition receives very little tolerance from the government. And many of the teachers were not members of opposition parties, but were criticising the government over sometimes teaching issues, educational issues, where their meetings were broken up by police.
Teachers in Ethiopia, as in other countries, have been victimised because they speak out and stand up for their rights.
Teachers are often large in number in countries. Teachers are the most educated section or large section of a population. And they're often strong in their trade unions. Sometimes when governments want to get a particular narrow ideology or to misuse or abuse their schools, teachers will say, no, we're not going to do it that way.
The Ethiopian Teachers Association is run by Gomora Kassa. He's clashed repeatedly with the government, which has tried unsuccessfully to close the union down.
This is my office. It has been sealed down since April 1993. Now, there was a ceiling here. It stays for years. That's the reason why it faded away. But you can see this is the order of the court, but the order is politically motivated. This is at the door for my assistant secretary. It is also closed down. The government wants to control this organization because they want to make it subservient to the political end of the party in power.
Gomora Kassa. Gomora.
Nice to meet you again here.
Good to see you, Gomora.
Steve Sinnott is a frequent visitor to Ethiopia and knows Gomora well. He has just been on an Education International fact-finding mission to Addis Ababa.
What teachers know around the world is that the Ethiopia Teachers Association is very, very special indeed. And the way in which you struggle for free trade unionism, for teachers to be able to speak up for the children in your country, speaking up for education for all, to get all children into school, the way you speak up for these things and for democracy is a real inspiration for teachers. So we thank you for everything you do on behalf of teachers in Ethiopia and for teachers across the world. Gomora.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Gomora Kassa, I think, is a very special man, modest man. He's one of the greatest people I've met in my life. Gomora was in exile in this country when his deputy was assassinated by the security forces in Ethiopia. And he returned, putting at risk his own life.
It could be imprisonment, it could be disappearance. Why not shooting? Because I have the experience of my colleague, Asaf Amar, who was murdered while he's on the way to the office. Or they may create another fictitious crime for me. They are very notorious for creating fictitious crime.
Steve Sinnott believes it's vital that British teachers support colleagues who are being persecuted in other countries.
We can't teach global citizenship in our classrooms without us attempting to practice that ourselves. And we can't encourage people to show some courage and advocate human rights without us being supporters of those people who show those particular qualities.
Our own government gives £130 million of aid a year to Ethiopia. Should we really be giving them this aid if they treat teachers this way?
The British government, I think, has a duty to ensure that it is vigilant about the way in which the government behaves that is receiving substantial amounts of aid, making sure that they cease the persecution of teachers.
In Afghanistan, the Taliban is threatening and murdering teachers, particularly in girls' schools. It's part of a move to wrest control of whole areas from the government, as Martin Bell, the former MP and BBC correspondent, saw on a recent trip.
The threats are delivered, not usually by word of mouth, but by little notes slipped into somebody's house at the dead of night. The target of these letters would not usually be a girl going to school, but a parent, a school governor, a teacher. They are then personally and directly threatened, and sometimes they just think it's too dangerous to continue because there are these physical attacks as well. These are not, nobody's bluffing here.
Teachers and education are a key area of conflict in Afghan history. During the Soviet period, teachers were targeted because they were seen to be supporting Soviet ideology. And today we're seeing confrontation between a Western-backed government trying to expand its education system against a resistance group which is concerned about the types of education that are being given to the children and perceive those to be a threat to their own ideology or their own belief system.
Do we know who's responsible for the attacks? Is it the Taliban or other groups?
The Taliban is one of these very vague and rather loose terms. There are many different groups involved, so it's a whole complex mix of things. But at the back is the ideology which insists that girls should be educated only in the Quran. We had a very affecting and moving meeting with the family of an 11-year-old girl who was killed. She just left school and was gunned down in cold blood by two men on a motorbike, and her best friend and a teacher were shot as well.
But in Afghanistan, parents and teachers are refusing to give in to intimidation. They're forming local committees to defend their schools, and there's some evidence that the number of attacks is falling.
During 2006, when there was this significant upsurge in attacks on schools, there were a series of kind of policy meetings in Kabul and an idea of asking communities to be involved in the protection of their schools, primarily through the parent-teacher associations, whereby they would post guards, they're called chowkidars in Afghanistan. And I think through 2007 we have seen that initiative begin to reduce the risk to schools as the number of attacks have reduced.
I think mobilising communities and teachers' role in that mobilisation and as part of that community, quite often in a leadership capacity, I think it's another way of saying enough is enough, this has to stop, and we are speaking up to make it stop.
It's not just the war-torn countries we hear about on the news where teachers are being gunned down. Armed police now guard schools in the 3 southernmost provinces of Thailand. In the last 3 years, more than 75 teachers have been assassinated by Islamic fighters seeking autonomy. In this incident in June 2007, 2 teachers were killed in the school library.
In some cases, they're quite targeted and quite brutal. In the case of some teachers at the beginning of 2007 who were who were essentially confronted in front of their students and were shot at point-blank range in front of their students. And other times, the assassinations have been what we'd call much more cowardly and much less brutal, just people riding the backs of motorcycles, for example, and gunning them down in the street.
When the government provided armed escorts for teachers, the fighters switched tactics to arson. More than 260 schools in the south have been burned down since 2004.
The insurgents are want to see the school system as the most, aside from the military, of course, as the most recognizable representation of the Thai government, which is largely Buddhist. Of course, most of the population in the country, save for the south, is Buddhist. The message I think that they're trying to send is that the discrimination that they've experienced, and indeed they have, it needs to be said that some of their grievances are quite legitimate.
So what are their grievances? I mean, is it the language they teach in? Or
The language is certainly one, and there have been a number of initiatives at the legislative level to try to allow either Malay or Yawi or other local dialects to be the language of instruction, at least in some of the schools in the south, the state-run schools. Of course, some of the Muslim schools are free as independent schools to teach in whatever language they see fit, but none of those initiatives have passed yet.
In many parts of the world, schools could help to ease tensions by promoting tolerance, and combatants could be encouraged to recognise them as neutral zones. In southern Thailand, that would mean teaching in the local language and teaching about Islam.
It's always been a very political question as to what's in the curriculum and who decides what's in the curriculum. And usually it's the government of the day of whichever country, regardless of how that government became the government, that makes those decisions. And in many countries, tracing through their history, they have a number of ethnic groups. They have a right to maintain their language and their culture, and often education is used to in fact achieve the opposite. So they lose their language, they lose their culture, instead of education being the means of retaining it and appreciating the diversity. It has been used in the opposite way.
In many countries, there's strong evidence that teachers, because of their status in society, are more vulnerable than ever, and are seen increasingly as legitimate targets by repressive governments and militant groups.
schools are such safe, normal parts of our lives, and yet in more and more places around the world, teachers and children can't just come and go without wondering whether they're going to be murdered by assassins or blown up by a bomb. It's time for the world to wake up to this problem. We must think more seriously about how we can provide protection for them, how we can ensure the perpetrators are prosecuted, and how we get to the point where schools are treated as zones of peace and recognized as safe sanctuaries.